Is it possible to find meaning in suffering? And can we truly understand history and the causation of historical events years later? Find out today on this episode of Around the Weird. Back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. As you saw in this new intro that I'm trying out, let me know if you are a fan or if you want to go back to the original intro. But as you saw in that intro, I am talking about a book today, one that focuses on suffering and war and Russia. I am, of course, referring to War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, which was published in 1868. The version that I have was translated by Richard Peviar and Larissa Volokonsky. For those who don't know, Leo Tolstoy was a Russian author who lived in the 1800s. He is primarily known for writing this book. He has written several other books, Anna Karenina, for example, and several short stories. But he's primarily known for what a lot of people would call his magnum opus. He was a Russian writer who wrote about existentialism and the human experience and Russia in general. And he won a lot of acclaim for his work. What's interesting, though, and what is mentioned in my copy of the library's copy that I got from my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. But what's interesting about that is, even though this is well regarded now, at the time people didn't really know how to talk about War and Peace because it seems to define genres, which I'll talk about later, and it doesn't fit in the traditional style of a novel. Leo Tolstoy did a bunch of interesting things here. It's also important to note that it took him 6 years to write this book, possibly even longer than that, and for good reason. This is about 1,200 pages, possibly, other editions might be longer or shorter depending on the translation, but it is quite a doozy, and there is a lot worth talking about. I feel like other YouTubers might have a better explanation of Leo Tolstoy out there. I'd recommend you go look into the Codex Cantina, as they have an entire catalog of before you read type series where they go into a little bit of analysis of the author too, and I believe they've cataloged Leo Tolstoy quite a bit on that channel. So I definitely recommend that you go out and check out their videos. I will put a link to it in the description for a high quality one that I happen to find. But yeah, so this book was pretty interesting. Just an early summary. I'm going to recommend it, but I'm also going to spoil it. I should also note that my book came with an introduction. It came with a historical index for the many historical events that Tolstoy references in this story. It also has a bit of a chapter summary, so you can understand exactly what Tolstoy is talking about at times. But it doesn't go into too deep detail that I could only rely on that. I definitely had to read to understand this story, and that's why it's taken me the better part of a month to get through it. So pretty interesting book. But without further ado, let's talk about War and Peace. I will try to be brief in my summary. I'll do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So War and Peace focuses on a group of Russian nobles in high Russian society at the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. The story really begins with them talking about Russian society, gossiping, and talking about Napoleon and how some are for him and others believe him to be a terrible force that is threatening Russia. And the story really focuses on a lot of different characters, but we can follow the stories of at least two of them here, including Andrei Bolkonovsky and Pierre Bezukhov. So two interesting characters. Andrei is ready for war. He feels that his life in the nobility is shallow, and he wants to find some meaning, which he thinks he'll do with the war. And meanwhile, Pierre, he witnesses his father die, or his sort of illegitimate father, because he's the illegitimate son. But he inherits some money in the estate, which other family members don't really like. And so his story takes place with him progressing through Russia in that way. Andrei ends up going to war, where he quickly finds that the generals are inexperienced, kind of idiots who care more about the sovereign, the Emperor Alexander, and than they do on the soldiers who seem to be dying. And a lot of the Russian forces are overwhelmed in his first stage of the war. And Andrei is disappointed. He's encouraged by a friend to leave the battlefield, but he sticks around because he thinks he'll produce some good for the war effort, maybe even be a hero and find that meaning that he's looking for. Meanwhile, Pierre marries a woman named Helene, who he doesn't actually love, but he feels kind of pressured by high society to get married. Later, he finds out that Helene might be cheating on him, and so he challenges the man who's having an affair to a duel. He manages to wound him. Helene finds out, is very upset, and wants a separation. Eventually, she'll fully leave Pierre to marry someone else, and she dies during the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. So things aren't good for her there. And as that's going on, the Battle of Austerlitz takes place, where the Russians get further butt whooped, sort of. And Andrei catches stray cannon fire, is lying on the battlefield staring up at the sky, feeling that everything is hopeless and meaningless. And Napoleon shows up, seemingly pretty noble, and gets Andrei the medical care he needs before moving on, not really seeing him as a valuable prisoner of war. People believe Andrei to be dead because they couldn't find him on the battlefield, but he returns eventually, just in time for his wife to give birth to their son, Nikolai. Unfortunately, his wife dies during childbirth, so it's not a good time to be Andrei. And Andrei is filled with kind of despair at this point. And so, of course, Pierre's doing his own kind of weird things. Andrei kind of has a couple chats with Pierre in an effort to find some meaning. Meanwhile, Pierre has joined the Masons, who have helped him find meaning through their version of God. And Pierre tries to spread that to Andrei, but it doesn't seem to work for Andrei. And the meaning that Pierre has kind of diminishes over the course of the story because he doesn't really make efforts to change his life. But meanwhile, Andrei does find some bit of happiness as he falls for Rostov's daughter, who is another character in the story. He falls for Natasha. They both seem into each other, but Natasha's pretty young and overly dramatic at times. And so when some other guy comes calling, a younger man named Anatoly, she doesn't really know what to tell Andrei. And so rather than deal with the heartbreak, Andrei just calls off their engagement, which makes them both pretty sad. At that point, Napoleon invades Russia. Tolstoy devotes several chapters to exploring Napoleon's character, kind of asserting that maybe he wasn't as big of a genius as everyone claims him to be. And we see the Battle of Borodino, which results in massive destruction for both the French and Russian forces. Pierre is on the front lines. He's kind of devastated and is shocked to see so much death, which hurts his sort of worldview. And Andrei is also on the battlefield. He ends up getting wounded pretty severely, watches Anatoly die and get his leg amputated, but he feels a greater love for not only his enemies but his friends, and he kind of sees meaning in that. And from there, the destruction of Moscow takes place. Pierre finds himself kind of lost at this point and decides he wants to kill Napoleon. And so he tries to do that, but he's captured by French forces and held prisoner, where he finds meaning in the suffering of being a prisoner there. Andrei, meanwhile, runs into Natasha and is taken care of by her, but he's at a point where he's ready to die. But before he dies, he realizes that death is an awakening, and he dies around both his sister, Maria, and Natasha. At a certain point, they mourn over him while Pierre is freed by his fellow Russians. The Russian forces manage to kick the French forces out of Russia, which ruins Napoleon in the end. And Pierre has a reunion with Natasha where they profess their love for one another. And as the story comes to a close in the epilogue, we see their marriage and how Pierre is at a different point in his life and feels a little bit more meaning because he feels connected with God and not really much else. And then, of course, Tolstoy goes on a tangent about what is the meaning of history and all of that. And that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, boy howdy, is there quite a bit worth talking about. I could fill hours and hours of video talking about War and Peace, the very specific things that Tolstoy talks about. I don't have enough time to do that. There are way better, books written out there that properly analyze this book, sort of needing to write like a completely separate book. But there are a lot of ideas that I'll touch upon here in order to give an effective review, but also an analysis of this amazing book, which I love, but I also have a number of problems with, which I'll get to in a few moments. But one of the main themes, one of the big ideas of this story, I would argue the central idea of this story is that of meaning. Both Pierre and Andrei try to find meaning in their lives at the time of the early 1800s. You can argue that other characters in the story try to find meaning, and whether or not they're successful is up in the air. But for Pierre and Andrei, they both want to find that meaning. Andrei feels that his life is superficial, and we see at the beginning of the story, he tells Pierre that life kind of sucks. Like he wishes that he would have held off getting married, that he would have done more, because he's not happy, and he ends up going off to war to find that meaning. Much like so many other young men do in many different stories. And it doesn't end well for Andrei, as it most likely doesn't end well for them. And Pierre, he's slowly coming to a point where he's realizing the lie of the nobility, the superficial nature of it all. And it's only through a conversation with one of the Masons that he comes to understand that his life has no real purpose, and without something to aim for. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "Look at your life, my dear sir. How have you been spending it? In riotous orgies and depravity, taking everything from society and giving it nothing. You received wealth. How have you used it? What have you done for your neighbor? Have you thought about the tens of thousands of your slaves? Have you helped them physically and morally? No. You have used their labor in order to lead a debauched life. That is what you have done. Have you chosen some position in which you could be useful to your neighbor? No. You have been spending your life in idleness. Then, my dear sir, you married, taking upon yourself the responsibility for guiding a young woman. And what did you do? You did not help her, my dear sir, to find the path of truth. You hurled her into an abyss of deceit and misfortune. A man insulted you, and you shot him, and you say that you do not know God and hate your life. That is no wonder, my dear sir." And that is a pretty amazing quote of one of the Masons taking Pierre to task and saying, you proclaim that you have no understanding of the meaning of anything, and you wonder where God is. Well, just look at your damn life, sir. You aspire to nothing, and you get nothing as a result. And I think that's a pretty powerful quote there. And it inspires Pierre to become better, to make some changes to his life. But it's obvious that it's not working because both Pierre and Andrei fall back into despair. Despite his love of Natasha, he breaks it off with Natasha and he loses meaning, at least for Andrei. And Pierre joins the Masons, but he still feels kind of lost, kind of like he hasn't quite figured out what purpose he's on this planet for, what his ultimate meaning, what the meaning of life is. And I feel like that's partially Pierre's fault in the story because he does make those changes, but he doesn't commit to them. He's still engaging in the same behavior, the same shallowness of the high-class nobility, doing things without real purpose, just living life and engaging in these petty things of high social class. Tolstoy is arguing that you need to not only just talk the talk, you need to walk the walk, that Pierre is kind of a loser who's not really committing to anything, and that's why he feels so lost. And you see a lot of this at the Battle of Borodino, where both Andrei and Pierre kind of have these realizations. Andrei, after he's wounded, sees Anatoly in the tent and has a connection to God, where he realizes that all of this is about love, God's love, and feeling closer to God, and that death is an awakening as he's dying. It's a deathbed realization for him. So kind of a little bit late when you think about it. And Pierre is seeing all these soldiers like casually joking on the battlefield and realizing all of this death and destruction is a far cry from the shallow, upper class life that he's been living. And like it causes him to just lose his faith and also go a little bit crazy, because he's like, oh yeah, everything is meaningless, I don't know what I'm doing. And as a prisoner he feels even more of that, but he does have his awakening where he turns to God and feels a deeper connection there. It's really fascinating. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. Thus he had looked at European life, politics, masonry, philosophy, philanthropy, but even then in moments he regarded as his own weakness, his mind had penetrated this distance, and there too he had seen the petty, the humdrum, the meaningless. Now he had learned to see the great, the eternal, and the infinite in everything, and therefore, in order to see it, to enjoy contemplating it, he had naturally abandoned the spyglass he had been looking through, until then, over people's heads, and joyfully contemplated the ever-changing, ever-great, unfathomable, and infinite life around him. And that closer he looked, the calmer and happier he became. The terrible question, why, which formerly had destroyed all his mental constructions, did not exist for him now. Now, to this question, why, a simple answer was already ready in his soul. Because there is God, that God without whose will not a single hair falls from a man's head. And there you have an interesting quote about the change that Pierre's been going through. Whereas before he didn't really understand what there was in life. Now he's turned to God, and that kind of provides him with an answer for everything. And it provides him contentment, as we see in the epilogue. He's no longer engaging in the shallow nature of the upper class life. He's only focused on his wife and his work, which is pretty cool for Pierre. But I do have to wonder, is this truly a happy end? Is this truly finding meaning in the suffering? Because for Andrei, he only finds it at the end of his life, and it's like, you could argue that that's maybe like sort of a deathbed sort of realization, or maybe a regret that he wasn't able to ever find anything, and he was suffering from fever more so than anything else, so his realization maybe can't be trusted. And for Pierre, it's even worse, because he saw the devastation in battle. And then he saw Moscow burn to the ground. And then he was taken prisoner, and he saw people executed around him, and only he was lucky to survive. So did he truly find meaning, or is this just a case of post-traumatic stress disorder? Like an early case of trauma, where it's not that he's found meaning, it's just that he's numb to everything else except for those that he loves, and he can't enjoy the world as he once did because he's seen so much suffering. It really seems like that's what Tolstoy is indicating through the story, and that maybe you can't find meaning anywhere, you can only find God, and that provides some answer for the suffering in life, but it doesn't necessarily provide all the answers. It feels like there's something hanging, something left there that Tolstoy is doing as intentional to show that life is just suffering and all you can do is rely on God. But that's a horrific message when you ultimately think about it. But maybe that's part of the Russian experience. Maybe that's an indicator that those who have seen war can't really ever find anything greater, that this is a circumstance of unfortunateness or something like that. Like Andrei and Pierre went through hell, and that's all they can expect from the world in the end. And speaking of hell, and also speaking of war, another big theme of this story, which isn't particularly new, other authors have explored it before, but I like how Tolstoy, touches upon it here, and that is war is hell. The hellish nature of war. Napoleon's invasion devastates Russia in the story. Not only Russia, but all of Europe, because you see different battles taking place all around Europe, eventually leading to the devastation of Russia, as not only does Napoleon invade and kill people, but the Russian people are burning down everything, including Moscow. And nobody can really save it until, after Napoleon leaves, which is pretty devastating to see what this war, this person or these people have done to the country. Everything is made worse by the fact that the Russian military is inexperienced. The higher ups don't really know what they're doing, and they're hoping that the beautiful, the wonderful sovereign Emperor Alexander will provide them with some guidance because he's just so wonderful. And I think they ascribe a lot to him that doesn't actually belong to him. That like any defeat or any win that they get in battle is due to him rather than to some luck that the Russians experienced. And so I think that contributes to some of the inexperience, the lack of knowledge, and the destruction that Russia experiences on this story. Because you especially see the Battle of Borodino, which the French and the Russians claim victory, but they both lost thousands and thousands of men there. And you see Pierre and Andrei experience the horrors of that battle firsthand. But what's also interesting is how like this hell is portrayed, and in regards to like the nobility too, because on the front lines everything is scary and devastating, but back in the city where the nobles are living comfortably, you could hardly tell that there's a war taking place except for some of the commentary of the super rich, of the nobility. In particular, they're proclaiming Napoleon to be an interesting man, but he's also a threat to Russia. And to me, it really seems like it's a game. Like they're sending these poor people off to war while they relax and chat about battle strategies and other such things. And it seems like a game. Like they don't actually care who wins. They just hope that they get more property out of the deal. And something even more damning is the fact that the nobles are talking about how Napoleon is evil, comparing him to like the Antichrist or whatnot. And in doing so, you would think, oh, well, they must think he's a threat, but they're still speaking French. If you think that Napoleon is such a threat, then why are you speaking his language? Like, why aren't you just speaking exclusively Russian? Why are you still celebrating French culture in some way? It doesn't actually seem like they view him as a threat. And again, this is just a land grab between like Alexander and Napoleon, showing the extent that the rich will go to gain or maintain power at the expense of so many lives lost in the middle and lower classes. And so the nobles don't really seem to have a commitment to war, even though this war is pretty devastating. It's all a game to them. And I think the lower classes seem to understand that, and that's why they're so willing to rob and pillage from Moscow, because if the nobles don't really care, why should they? Another interesting aspect of this story is that at various points Tolstoy just stops the story to discuss the philosophy of Napoleon and of the great man theory, essentially saying that history is dictated by great men who move public opinion and other such things in one direction and influence history in that way. And a lot of what Tolstoy says is, no, the people have more power. The people influence the great leaders, which influences history. And is it really possible to understand history years later after the fact when none of us were those people? And in fact, people like Napoleon actively lied about certain historical events to seem more important, or to disguise the fact that they were dumb and bumbling fools. So a lot of that going on in the story, but you especially see that with Tolstoy's sort of introspection about the individual versus the whole, where Tolstoy challenges that historical view of Napoleon and Russia, saying that Napoleon worked hard against the Russian forces, but the Russians were inexperienced, and that it maybe wasn't his idea to do certain aspects of the battle, that he was influenced by his men, the French soldiers, and what Alexander was doing as well, and how the Russians maybe got lucky a lot of the time, how they seemed to know what they were doing in regards to the burning of Moscow and fleeing Napoleon when it mattered most, essentially doing partisan or guerrilla warfare, and the Russians probably weren't as calculating at that it took the people of Russia realizing that things weren't going their way to behave a certain way, which influenced those higher ups, not really showing that it was their choice in the matter, even if people said it might have been years later. And so essentially what Tolstoy is arguing in this story is that the people matter, that you can't just ascribe the overall value of history to individuals, or to individuals. Like, you have to ascribe it to everybody and understand that, like, Napoleon rise to power because of the French Revolution, and the French Revolution happened because of the French nobility and King Louis during the 1700s, and that was allowed to happen because of other stuff that happened in the 17 and 1600s. So there's a lot of errors in history that have been ascribing one person as a main factor, when actually there were a bunch of different factors at play. And it creates a lot of problems with trying to understand history and not make the same mistakes of the past, which is fascinating that Tolstoy would go through such an in-depth exploration of such things. You can also see, like, that with the fictional part of the story as well, where he examines Pierre and Andrei and Rostov and Natasha and Maria, showing all their passions, all their desires are affecting possibly what's happening at large in Russia, and that it's not simply Napoleon or like Kutsov, one of the Russian leaders in this story, that there's a bunch of different people at play. And I think that's a pretty interesting way to tell this story. There are other excellent things about this story, specifically Tolstoy's focus on reputation in the upper classes, how it's so important, and when Pierre feels that his reputation is challenged, he challenges a man to a duel and shoots him, but that only makes his wife even angrier. So you're seeing a little bit of the social role of the upper classes as well. And then the use of language, again, as I mentioned before, like the nobles still using French, even though they proclaim like Napoleon to be an enemy of the people, to be the Antichrist. And the use of like Russian and German in the story, I feel like it's very intentional on Tolstoy's part. And then also he does appear to be critical of power, as I mentioned before, saying, these people in power, we ascribe a lot of responsibility to them, but we also say they're very important, when in fact, they might have gotten thousands of people killed irresponsibly. And then also the Russian nobles, how they seem to be more focused on themselves than the common people, and that's costing lives as well. There does seem to be a social element, a social commentary on the nobles, but at the same time, he doesn't go as far as one would hope. And that brings me to, what the elements that I didn't really like about this story. Although I said he was critical of power, he does feel a little too soft on the rich, on the nobles of the story. Which is interesting. At the time this was written, a lot of leftists in particular said that he was too soft on nobility, focusing on the beautification of the upper classes rather than appropriately acknowledging that they're causing a lot of problems, and that they're very more self-centered, and he's trying to glorify, to some degree, these people in power. And I would say yes, indeed, he does appear to be a little bit soft, but he is also critical. It feels like there's a mixture there, and it's really difficult to tell where Tolstoy stands at times. And that's what's also interesting is, again, this was written in the 1860s. Who else was writing at this time? Who else was contributing to literature that would later go on to criticize, the Russian nobility? And the answer is Karl Marx. A lot of socialist writings were coming out. And so to see that, and then also to see War and Peace, which kind of glorifies that in a way, I can understand why some people would be upset. And then also this story is very philosophical at times, but sometimes it does feel like nonsense. I'm not really sure if Tolstoy's background is in history, but he has a lot of points that he's making, but other times it sounds like he's just rambling on and on, shouting nonsense about what he thinks about historical figures and whatnot. But one funny problem is that he does criticize naturalists and the theory of evolution, which is what Darwin was doing around this time. And it's funny because he's critical of it, but later it would go on to be proven accurate to some degree. So you can see that he's clearly not really knowledgeable about certain areas and just making judgments in a lot of cases that are unfounded. So that's a weak point against this story. And then also it can feel unfocused at times. Given its large, grand scoping nature, that is a great point about this, or like that is points for this story. Like it's really good that it can be wide and grand scoping, epic and feeling, focusing on all of these people and painting a picture of Russia at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. But at the same time, that lack of focus, it feels like he's meandering at times. It feels like he's focusing on characters who are unimportant to the story. It feels like he's going off on tangents that don't really make any sense. And you end up with this sort of unfocused story where you forget what's happening to Andrei. And you have to go in the back of the book and be like, oh, that's what happened to Andrei like 3,000 chapters ago. I'm exaggerating there, but that unfocused nature kind of dilutes the story in a way, and if you could make it shorter, but I feel like you would sacrifice a lot in the story. So this is a criticism, but it's also an acknowledgement that this is intentional on Tolstoy's part, and it contributes to the epic feeling of the story. So it might sound contradictory, but you can criticize and praise something at the same time. Anyway, those are my thoughts on War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Count Leo Tolstoy, he was a member of the nobility, which might be why he wasn't so willing to criticize the nobility as much as he could. I really enjoyed this story, even if I didn't talk about everything that I could have talked about in this story. In particular, there's a lot to be addressed, including his depiction of Napoleon, his depiction of Kutsov, the general who kind of saves Russia in the end, or saves Russia in the end. Natasha's character, Maria's character, Andrei's father's unwillingness to see him get married again. The overall destruction of Moscow and how it's a very well written chapter. Pretty much from the Battle of Borodino on, this story goes pretty hard and is pretty solid. And also the world building at the beginning of the story, which contributes to the unfocused nature, because it's just a series of dinners where like you see Andrei and Pierre and other characters kind of introducing themselves before the events of the story take place. So there's quite a bit worth talking about that I didn't mention here. If you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. There's a lot worth discussing, and there's some good conversation here. And in a way, you kind of need to be in a group and discuss this, because just discussing it by yourself, like, you kind of miss out on that interpretation part of it, because there's a lot of different ways you can interpret Andrei's story and Pierre's story and really everything that happens in this story. So let me know what you're thinking. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And I have a hard time imagining someone who doesn't know that this story even exists, but there might be some people out there. Also join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books or movies or other forms of media. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and in search of meaning travels. Farewell.